Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us on Worldview Channel 247. Tonight, we bring you an in-depth report on the latest developments in the intensifying conflict between Iran and Israel. Yesterday, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps forces executed a precision missile operation that stunned military analysts and exposed critical vulnerabilities in Israel's multi-layered air defense architecture. According to official statements from the Tasnim news agency, the IRGC integrated advanced electronic warfare modules and upgraded signals intelligence capabilities into their command and control network. As a result, Israeli Patriot David's Sling and Iron Dome batteries suffered cascading failures, encrypted data links were jammed, radars were echo-jammed, and interceptor missiles inadvertently targeted friendly launchers. Over the course of a single salvo, more than 20 Israeli interceptors were neutralized by friendly fire incidents, dramatically reducing Israel's capacity to intercept subsequent ballistic trajectories. Despite decades of marketing by Western defense contractors touting these systems as invulnerable, the Israel Defense Forces publicly acknowledged yesterday that no air defense shield can guarantee complete protection. Civilian authorities issued emergency directives urging residents in Haifa, Tel Aviv, and Beersheba to seek immediate shelter in reinforced structures and maintain battery-powered radios for continuous alerts. Hospitals across central Israel activated surge protocols, erecting triage tents in parking lots and deploying additional trauma surgeons to handle an unprecedented influx of blast and fragmentation casualties. By dawn, official tallies confirmed that at least 4 Israeli civilians were killed, 2 in Ashdod, during a sudden impact on a residential block, one first responder in Tel Aviv succumbing to shrapnel wounds, and an IDF radar technician who perished inside a coastal command post. Scores more were treated for smoke inhalation cardiac events provoked by sudden explosions and severe lacerations. Public morale, already strained by months of low-intensity clashes, plummeted further after a Con 11 poll revealed that only 42% of Israeli citizens now support continued military escalation, a steep drop from 68% just 1 week ago. Opposition factions in the Knesset have seized on these figures to demand an immediate diplomatic initiative, accusing Prime Minister Netanyahu of lacking strategic clarity or an exit plan. Meanwhile, in Tehran, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei delivered a defiant national address broadcast across state television. He described Israel's preemptive airstrikes on Iranian territory as heinous acts of aggression and pledged that Iran would continue to deliver surgical and devastating blows against the Zionist regime until its essential military and nuclear infrastructure was rendered inoperable. Footage accompanying his speech showed freshly mobilized IRGC brigades conducting live fire drills at the Imam Khomeini range, supervised by senior commanders, and integrating newly acquired weapon system software designed to counter electronic warfare tactics. IRGC General Hossein Salami emphasized that Iran's digital shield assault framework could blind enemy radars and render hostile air defenses ineffective even before a single warhead crossed the border. International defense analysts have noted the remarkable speed at which the IRGC reconstituted its command structure after initial Israeli strikes. Dr. Chita Pasi, vice president of the Kinsey Institute for National Responsibility, explained that within 48 hours of targeted attacks on Iranian headquarters bunkers and encrypted communication nodes, Tehran deployed mobile command centers equipped with satellite uplinks and hardened firmware updates, ensuring uninterrupted coordination across multiple missile brigades. What we are witnessing, Dr. Pasi observed, is a new era of strategic depth for Iran, where resilient C-2 systems can recover rapidly and sustain offensive operations under direct attack. Adding to Iran's arsenal of tactics was a sophisticated deception operation revealed by retired Major General Fareed Aaron, now a defense professor at Istanbul University. According to Aaron, Tehran deployed dozens of decoy radar emitter stations across remote desert locations west of Tehran. These dummy installations broadcast wave signatures nearly identical to those of Iran's genuine SA-20 and corded 15 batteries. Israeli ELINT platforms, including F-15E reconnaissance variants and unmanned drones, were then lured into striking these false targets with precision-guided munitions, exhausting valuable ordnance, and revealing the true whereabouts of Iran's authentic air defense arrays. Subsequent IRGC anti-radar missile launches targeted Israeli surveillance aircraft operating overhead, downing 3 F-35I Adir stealth fighters in quick succession, aircraft previously considered impervious to conventional surface-to-air defenses. Helmet camera footage smuggled out by one surviving pilot captured the moment of impact, a sudden flash of orange, a cascade of warning sirens, and total loss of multi-spectrum vision. In response, the IDF launched retaliatory strikes on Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities at Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan. Western nuclear experts emphasize that while the outer buildings at Natanz suffered structural damage, the core centrifuge halls buried beneath over 100 feet of reinforced concrete remain intact. Analysts at the American Enterprise Institute suggest that only specialized bunker-busting munitions, such as the USGBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, could realistically threaten these hardened vaults. Back in Israel, political fallout is mounting. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faces intensifying dissent within his coalition, with junior partners threatening a no-confidence motion unless a clear diplomatic track is opened. Security Committee members in the Knesset have demanded a joint session with top military brass to clarify objectives and rules of engagement. Meanwhile, Defense Minister Naim has called for an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council to address what he terms Iran's flagrant violations of sovereign airspace and global security norms. Prominent military correspondent Alexei Bezenko highlights a critical flaw in the current stalemate. Israel's missile defense architecture was designed primarily to counter lower-volume barrages from non-state actors such as Hezbollah or Hamas, not the sustained volley of hundreds of precision ballistic and cruise missiles that Iran can deploy. On the morning of June 16th, IRGC ballistic brigades launched an estimated 120 Fateh 110 and Zolfagar rockets at strategic sites including the Haifa petrochemical zone and Dimona reactor's outer security perimeter. Multiple ground-level recordings show plumes of orange flame as interceptors fail to detonate incoming warheads, leaving large sections of infrastructure exposed. Civilian medical centers across northern Israel report over 70 casualties, with trauma psychologists warning of long-term mental health fallout from continuous air raid sirens and shelter directives. In southern Iran, state media confirmed dozens of IRGC fatalities, including several high-ranking commanders. Mourning ceremonies in Tehran's historic Ray Cemetery drew thousands under banners, declaring martyrs on the path of defense, further fueling nationalist fervor and resolve. Global energy markets have reacted sharply. Brent crude spiked to $87 per barrel, the highest level since late 2024, on fears of a potential blockade in the Strait of Hormuz or Red Sea shipping lanes. Traders warn that prolonged hostilities could disrupt up to 20% of seaborne oil shipments, driving down supply availability and pushing consumer fuel prices higher worldwide. Amid the Middle East crisis, Ukraine is also maneuvering on the diplomatic front. Parliamentary Deputy Oleksandr Dubinsky told local outlets that Kyiv is leveraging the international focus on Tehran and Jerusalem to secure fresh military and financial aid. Reports suggest Ukrainian strategists are even contemplating a secondary front in Transnistria to stretch Russian resources, an initiative discussed during recent meetings between President Volodymyr Zelensky and Moldova's President Maya Sandu. Analysts caution that any incursion into this breakaway region risk widening the conflict and drawing NATO into direct confrontation. Russian state-controlled media have simultaneously stoked rumors of a 10,000-strong troop deployment to Transnistria, though Western defense officials deny evidence of any such buildup. Nonetheless, NATO has placed its eastern flank on heightened alert, citing the unpredictable interplay between the Ukraine war and Middle Eastern hostilities. In a rare direct call, President Vladimir Putin urged President Donald Trump to explore avenues for de-escalation, despite Russia's ongoing arms sales to both Tehran and Jerusalem, a dual-track diplomacy aimed at maximizing geopolitical leverage. International reaction to the Iran-Israel escalation has been swift and multifaceted. In Washington, National Security Advisor, NAME, convened an emergency session at the White House reaffirming unequivocal U.S. support for Israel's right to self-defense while warning Tehran that any further aggression would incur consequences far beyond the region. The U.S. Department of Defense simultaneously confirmed the redeployment of 2 additional Aegis-equipped destroyers to the eastern Mediterranean, augmenting existing missile defense assets and providing on-call support for Israeli intercept operations. American Patriot batteries already stationed in Jordan and Cyprus have been placed on heightened readiness, and U.S. Special Operations Forces in Iraq and Syria have been ordered to reinforce perimeter security around military installations, potentially targeted by Iranian proxies. Across the Atlantic, London's Foreign Office expressed grave concern and called for immediate restraint. Foreign Secretary Name underscored Britain's alignment with Israel in opposing Iranian state-sponsored terrorism, while also urging both parties to step back from the brink. The Royal Navy's Carrier Strike Group, currently operating in the eastern Mediterranean, conducted joint exercises with the Hellenic Navy near Crete, signaling solidarity with NATO allies. Meanwhile, French President Name issued a rare statement suggesting that Paris might facilitate discreet shuttle diplomacy between Tehran and Jerusalem, drawing on France's historical ties to both the P5+1 nuclear negotiations and its decades-long arms relationship with Israel. In Moscow, the Kremlin reiterated Russia's role as a potential mediator, noting its defense cooperation agreements with Iran, particularly the recent delivery of S-400 surface-to-air missile systems, as well as its long-standing intelligence-sharing relationship with Israel. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov stressed that Moscow regrets the current spiral of violence and is prepared to host a trilateral summit involving the U.S., Iran, and Israel. Observers, however, are skeptical of Russia's neutrality, pointing to its simultaneous arms sales and political alliances as evidence of a transactional approach. Beijing's response was more circumspect. China's foreign ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian called for maximum restraint and emphasized the need for all parties to respect international law and United Nations resolutions. Beijing's strategic calculus hinges on securing uninterrupted energy imports from the Middle East. Some 50% of China's oil arrives via the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb routes, while balancing its growing diplomatic ties in the Gulf Cooperation Council. Within the United Nations, Secretary General Antonio Guterres convened an Emergency Security Council session. Though the U.S. threatened to veto any resolution explicitly condemning Israel's retaliatory strikes, a consensus emerged around an unbranded presidential statement calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and the creation of protected corridors for civilians caught in crossfire. The vote produced a rare alignment among the P5 members. Russia and China abstained rather than vetoing, reflecting global unease at the risk of a wider conflagration. On the ground in Gaza and southern Lebanon, proxy groups have already been drawn deeper into the vortex. Hezbollah's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah declared solidarity with Tehran, ordering long-range rockets to target northern Israeli military installations. In response, the IDF conducted pre-dawn air raids on Hezbollah's missile depots in the Bekaa Valley, marking a significant escalation along Israel's northern border. Meanwhile, Iran-backed militias in Iraq launched rocket salvos at U.S. bases in Erbil and al-Assad, prompting retaliatory drone strikes by American forces. Yemen's Houthi rebels, aligned with Tehran, announced the closure of the southern Red Sea shipping lane to all vessels flagged by Western powers threatening to disrupt up to 12% of global maritime trade. Coalition naval forces, including British and French warships, have responded by initiating freedom of navigation patrols, raising the prospect of direct naval skirmishes. Amid these developments, Qatar and Oman have quietly stepped up shuttle diplomacy. Qatari Foreign Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani traveled to Tehran to convey a Saudi invitation for Iran to participate in an emergency GCC summit, an overture that Riyadh hopes will dampen sectarian tensions and restore a modicum of Gulf cooperation. Omani Sultan Haitham bin Tariq, leveraging his nation's traditionally neutral stance, has offered Muscat as a venue for back-channel talks addressing prisoner exchanges and limited ceasefires. Humanitarian organizations warn of dire consequences if hostilities continue unabated. The International Committee of the Red Cross has reported severe shortages of medical supplies in northern Israel, where field hospitals are operating at double capacity. In Iran's Khuzestan province, where Iranian launches originated water treatment plants, have suffered power outages due to precautionary blackouts, leaving tens of thousands without safe drinking water. UNICEF has appealed for funding to support displaced families on both sides of the border, while Médecins Sans Frontières Doctors Without Borders has dispatched emergency teams to Lebanon to treat casualties from cross-border shelling. Energy markets remain on edge. Brent crude has lingered near $90 per barrel, while natural gas futures in Europe spiked by 15% amid fears of supply disruptions through Turkey and the eastern Mediterranean. Shipping insurance premiums for vessels traversing the Gulf of Aden have more than doubled, and several major carriers have rerouted their tankers around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to transit times and increasing freight costs. Economic forecasters caution that prolonged conflict could shave up to 0.3% off global GDP growth for 2025, hitting emerging markets hardest. Countries heavily reliant on Middle Eastern oil from India to Japan may face inflationary pressures, potentially undermining post-pandemic recovery efforts. Central banks are monitoring the situation closely, with the European Central Bank convening an emergency policy meeting to assess the impact on energy-driven inflation. In parallel, think tanks in Washington and Brussels are debating longer-term policy frameworks. Some advocate for reviving elements of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, as a confidence-building measure, albeit with stronger verification and sunset clauses. Others propose a Gulf-wide security pact akin to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OCE, to establish no-strike zones, coordinated naval patrols, and rapid humanitarian response protocols. Tonight's conflict has profound implications for global markets and strategic balances. Let's begin with the energy sector, oil, gas, and maritime trade routes. Energy market shockwaves. Since the IRGC's missile salvos and the subsequent retaliatory strikes, Brent crude prices have hovered near $90 per barrel, up from $76 just 2 weeks ago. Analysts at the International Energy Agency, IEA, attribute this surge to fears of disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of world seaborne oil flows. Several Gulf producers, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, have issued statements reaffirming their commitment to stable production, but markets remain jittery. European natural gas futures also spiked by 15%, driven by concerns that any escalation could threaten pipelines running through Turkey or under the eastern Mediterranean, critical supplies for the European Union's post-pandemic recovery. Maritime insurance premiums for vessels traversing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and Gulf of Aden have more than doubled, prompting major shipping lines to reroute tankers around the Cape of Good Hope. These diversions add up to 10 out of 14 days to voyage times and increase freight costs by 20 to 30%. Commodity traders warn that sustained higher shipping rates may feed into global inflationary pressures, potentially forcing central banks already wary of post-pandemic labor shortages to contemplate interest rate hikes sooner than planned. Global economic impact economist at the World Bank project that prolonged hostilities could shave as much as 0.3% off global GDP growth in 2025, with emerging markets in Asia and Africa bearing the brunt. India, which imports 80% of its oil, may see its import bill swell by an estimated $15 billion annually. Japan's manufacturing sector, reliant on stable gas supplies, has already seen electricity costs rise 5% in recent weeks. In Africa, countries such as Kenya and South Africa could face diesel and petrol shortages if transit delays persist, complicating logistics for agriculture and mining operations. Strategic military scenarios with conventional battle space dynamics evolving. Military planners in both Tehran and Jerusalem are weighing potential next steps. Iranian Phase 3 options. Deployment of longer-range cruise missiles, e.g. Sumar variants, to strike beyond Israel's northern or southern flanks, potentially targeting energy or military infrastructure in Cyprus or southern Turkey. Use of advanced sea-skimming anti-ship missiles launched from IRGC Navy fast attack craft in the Persian Gulf, threatening oil tanker traffic and coalition naval vessels. Activation of proxy campaigns unleashing Hezbollah to launch simultaneous missile barrages from Lebanon, while Houthi forces intensify Red Sea interdiction operations stretching Israel's and coalition naval defenses. Israeli counter-escalation measures. Preemptive neutralization of Iranian missile production facilities in western Iran via high-altitude bomber sorties leveraging U.S.-built F-15Is and F-16Is with precision munitions. Expanded airstrikes against IRGC command posts and drone launch sites in Syria and Iraq, targeting senior officers and logistics hubs. Cyber offensive operations aimed at disrupting Iranian air defense radars and missile factory computer systems actions that, if traced back to Israel, could invite broader cyber retaliation. Each scenario carries significant risk. A strike into Cyprus or Turkey could draw NATO directly into the conflict under Article 5 collective defense obligations. Similarly, renewed Iranian proxy offensives in Lebanon or Yemen threaten to ignite multiple theaters simultaneously, forcing Israel, and by extension the United States, to allocate resources across a vastly expanded front. Humanitarian toll and displacement. The escalating violence has precipitated a growing humanitarian crisis. Israel, over 150,000 residents in northern and central districts have spent the past week under continuous shelter alerts. Civil defense reports indicate that 12 temporary displacement sites have opened in safer southern regions, accommodating roughly 8,000 internally displaced persons, IDPs. The Israeli Red Cross has delivered emergency medical kits and psychological support teams to these shelters, emphasizing trauma care for children exposed to repeated siren alarms. Oran, in Khuzestan and Hormozgan provinces, the launch points for IRGC brigades power companies, have implemented planned blackouts to reduce the risk of missile-triggered grid failures. Local hospitals report shortages of intravenous fluids, antibiotics, and burn treatment supplies. Médecins Sans Frontières has appealed for oxygen concentrators and trauma surgery kits, warning that without swift aid, mortality rates among injured civilians could double. Lebanon and Iraq, sporadic Hezbollah shelling along the Israel-Lebanon border has forced 25,000 Lebanese villagers to flee northward. UNHCR reports that 70% of these IDPs are women and children, many sleeping in makeshift tents supplied by the Lebanese Red Cross. In Iraq, Shia militia rocket attacks on U.S. bases have led to the temporary evacuation of 2,500 American personnel from Al-Assad and Erbil, disrupting ongoing operations against Islamic State remnants. Human rights and legal considerations. International legal experts have begun examining potential breaches of the laws of armed conflict, proportionality, and distinction. Critics argue that Iran's bombardment of urban areas where civilian casualties mount may violate principles of distinction and proportionality under the Geneva Conventions, use of decoys, and deception. While deception is a long-standing element of warfare, the deliberate induction of friendly fire incidents raises novel questions about liability for unintended casualties among one's own forces, though any accountability would be internal to the offending military. Hostage and detention policies. Hezbollah's seizure of IDF soldiers during cross-border raids has sparked calls for invocation of the Third Geneva Convention to address prisoner of war treatment. Similar scrutiny is directed at Iran's detention of foreign nationals on espionage allegations. Diplomatic track revival of the JCPOA. Behind the scenes, diplomatic back channels are exploring avenues to defuse the conflict. Partial JCPOA restoration. European and Russian intermediaries suggest reviving key elements of the 2015 nuclear deal, focusing on a 6-month freeze of enrichment activity in exchange for incremental sanctions relief coupled with a parallel cessation of hostile airstrikes. Gulf Security Framework. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have proposed a regional security dialogue bringing together Gulf Cooperation Council members, Iraq, Egypt, and Jordan, to negotiate confidence-building measures, establishment of no-fly zones, joint maritime patrols, and shared intelligence against extremist threats. U.S.-Russia-China Trilateral Summit. U.S. and Russian envoys have quietly discussed hosting a summit in Geneva or Beijing, aiming to secure Chinese buy-in vital for enforcing any agreement and to leverage its economic influence over Iran. However, deep-seated mistrust and domestic political constraints make any breakthrough challenging. Iran's hardliners demand full U.S. sanctions relief and recognition of Iran's right to defense, while Israeli leaders insist on Tehran's irreversible rollback of nuclear infrastructure. As the Iran-Israel confrontation deepens, multiple proxy theaters and new domains of warfare have come into play, expanding the conflict's scope far beyond direct missile exchanges. Tonight we examine the proxy dynamics in Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq, the emerging cyber and space domain clashes and their broader implications. Proxy fronts in Lebanon. Lebanon's Hezbollah, long Tehran's most capable Shiite proxy, has escalated its involvement dramatically. Following Iranian missile strikes on Israeli cities, Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah declared that Hezbollah's resistance rockets would target Israeli military bases north of the Litani River. In the first 48 hours, Hezbollah launched over 80 short-range Katyusha and advanced Fateh 110 missiles at IDF positions in the Galilee, drawing retaliatory Israeli air raids on suspected missile storage sites in the Bekaa Valley. Local reports indicate significant damage to rural villages near Baalbek and Hermel, displacing over 10,000 residents who have sought refuge further inland. Lebanon's fragile infrastructure, already weakened by economic collapse, now strains under the dual pressures of mass displacement and damaged electric substations, exacerbating nationwide blackouts. The Lebanese army, constitutionally barred from direct engagement with Israel, has been deployed in Beirut to maintain internal stability amid rising sectarian tensions. Yemen's strategic gambit. In Sana'a, Houthi leadership announced that the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a critical choke point for Red Sea shipping, would be closed to vessels linked to Zionist and Western interests. Within hours, Houthi Naval Command reported missile boat and anti-ship missile attacks on 2 merchant vessels flagged by European nations, forcing the temporary suspension of several routes. In response, the U.S.-led Combined Maritime Forces CMF launched aerial surveillance patrols and deployed additional mine countermeasure vessels to the southern Red Sea. British Type 45 destroyers and French Frem frigates joined multilateral patrols, raising the risk of naval skirmishes. Shipping companies, alarmed by heightened insurance premiums, began rerouting cargoes around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to transit times and driving up freight costs by 25%. Iraq's sectarian militias. In Baghdad and northern Iraq, Iran-backed militias, notably Kataib Hezbollah and Asaib al-Haq, have intensified rocket attacks on U.S. bases at al-Assad and Erbil International Airport. Over 150 rockets were fired in coordinated salvos, prompting the evacuation of nearly 2,000 U.S. personnel to secure facilities deeper within Iraqi Kurdistan. The Pentagon's Joint Chiefs have authorized limited drone strikes against militia, command and control nodes risking an uptick in U.S.-Iraq tensions and potential Iraqi governmental backlash. These militias, rewarded by Tehran with advanced short-range ballistic missiles, have signaled their readiness to open a second front if direct Iranian assets come under sustained attack. Prime Minister Naim in Baghdad has publicly condemned all foreign military interventions, balancing between U.S. ally obligations and domestic pressures from powerful Shiite blocs. Cyber warfare blurred lines beyond kinetic strikes. Both sides have launched sophisticated cyber operations. Israel's Unit 8200 is reported to have deployed malware targeting Iran's missile industrial infrastructure, corrupting design files, and causing delays in warhead production. Tehran's Eagle Shark Cyber Command retaliated by infiltrating Israeli water treatment facilities near Haifa, triggering false chlorine alarms that forced temporary shutdowns of 3 plants. Cybersecurity experts warn that this tit-for-tat could spill into civilian critical infrastructure power grids, banking systems, and emergency services, creating cascading disruptions. International law on cyber conflict remains nascent, complicating attribution and legal responses. Space domain satellite jamming and reconnaissance. Both nations rely heavily on satellite-based intelligence. Israeli communication satellites have been used to coordinate real-time targeting, while Iranian observation satellites survey launch site dispersal movements. Recently, Iran activated new ground-based GPS jammers positioned on Keshm Island, interfering with U.S. Navy navigation systems operating in the Strait of Hormuz. In retaliation, the U.S. Space Force reportedly ordered the retasking of missile warning satellites to prioritize early detection of Iranian launches. Israel's OFEC spy satellites operating in low Earth orbit have intensified passes over Iranian territory, providing precision imagery to mission planners. This covert space contest underscores how modern warfare transcends terrestrial boundaries. Regional ripple effects. The conflagration has unsettled neighboring states. Jordan, hosting both U.S. and British military assets, has doubled air patrols along its northern border and deployed additional mechanized brigades to deter spillover. Egypt, controlling the Suez Canal exit, has convened a Gulf Security Summit in Cairo, inviting Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, and Oman to discuss maritime security assurances and reduce the risk of escalation in the Red Sea. Turkey, balancing relations with both NATO and Tehran, has offered to mediate shuttle talks between Israeli and Iranian envoys, though both sides have thus far rebuffed Ankara's overtures. President Naim of Turkey faces domestic criticism for perceived indecision as Turkish lira volatility and tourist cancellation strain the economy. Implications for global security architecture. NATO, long focused on the Russia threat, has held emergency consultations among defense ministers. While no Article 5 obligation directly applies, ministers acknowledge that a Middle Eastern war entangling major powers could have far-reaching security implications, including increased refugee flows to Europe, disrupted energy supplies, and the potential for terror group exploitation of chaos. The United Nations has dispatched special envoys to Tehran, Jerusalem, and Riyadh, seeking to establish humanitarian pauses and civilian protection mechanisms. However, without enforceable mandates, such efforts risk being overtaken by battlefield developments. As the Iran-Israel confrontation evolves, strategic forecasts vary widely among defense analysts and policymakers. Below, we examine key expert perspectives on potential turning points, humanitarian response coordination, and plausible de-escalation pathways. Strategic forecasts. Protracted stalemate scenario. Several retired generals and think tank experts predict that the conflict will settle into a prolonged exchange of intermittent missile salvos and airstrikes Under this scenario, both sides avoid all-out escalation to nuclear or major ground incursions, preferring controlled retaliations that demonstrate resolve without triggering regional war. Israel maintains air superiority with limited strikes on high-value Iranian military sites, while Iran continues periodic long-range strikes to sustain pressure. Proxy fronts remain active but constrained by implicit red lines. Economic sanctions and global oil price volatility persist, but diplomatic channels slowly reopen through third-party mediators. Phase 3. Iranian escalation. Other analysts warn that Tehran still retains undisclosed strategic options that could upend the current balance. These include launching extended-range cruise missiles into allied territories, potentially striking NATO partners such as Cyprus or Turkey, or authorizing Hezbollah to fire precision rockets at Israeli civilian centers. Should Iran activate these measures, Israel might feel compelled to undertake deeper, preemptive strikes on Iranian soil, risking widespread hostilities. Iran's reported stockpiles of hundreds of ballistic missiles combined with new electronic warfare tactics could saturate Israeli defenses beyond current capabilities. Limited diplomatic breakthrough. A more optimistic school of thought argues that mutual war weariness, coupled with mounting domestic political pressures in Tehran and Jerusalem, could prompt both governments to accept mediated compromises. This might involve an interim ceasefire, prisoner exchanges, limited sanctions relief for Iran, and explicit security guarantees for Israel, potentially underwritten by the U.S., EU, and Gulf states. Should such an agreement materialize, it might pave the way for revived nuclear negotiations and reduced proxy group hostilities. Critics caution that without robust verification mechanisms and credible enforcement, the ceasefire could collapse under residual mistrust. Wider regional war, support. Minority of strategists contend that miscalculation or third-party intervention could spark full-scale regional conflict. Possible triggers include an inadvertent strike on a major power's asset, direct Iranian or Israeli action against a nuclear reactor, Dimona or Fordo, or serious naval engagements in the Red Sea. In such a scenario, U.S. and Russian forces could become entangled, drawing in Gulf Arab states, Turkey, and potentially China. The United Nations would likely struggle to contain widespread combat, leading to catastrophic humanitarian and economic fallout. Humanitarian response coordination. Amid these strategic forecasts, humanitarian organizations face immense coordination challenges across multiple conflict zones. Joint Operations Cell, the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC World Food Program, WFP, and United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, have established a Joint Operations Cell in Amman, Jordan. This body synchronizes airlift deliveries of medical supplies to Israel, Iran, Lebanon, and Iraq, ensuring cross-border access protocols despite contested airspace. Recent airdrops included 50,000 trauma surgery kits, 100 mobile water purification units, and 200 rehydration saline pallets. Safe zone coordination. To protect displaced civilians, OCHA and UNHCR have negotiated humanitarian safe zones in southern Israel's Negev region and western Iran's Kermanshah province. Each zone offers temporary shelter for up to 20,000 IDPs, with sanitation, food distribution, and mental health support staffed by international NGOs. Security guarantees are monitored by third-party observers from neutral countries, including Switzerland and Sweden. Cross-border medical corridors, recognizing the acute shortage of specialized care, Italy and Germany have funded cross-border medical evacuation corridors. Critical patients from Lebanon and Iran can now be transferred to EU hospitals via hospital ships docked in Larnaca, Cyprus, and Crete, Greece. This initiative has already saved 120 lives, particularly for burn victims and pediatric trauma cases. Protection of Cultural Heritage UNESCO has issued emergency appeals to safeguard threatened archaeological sites in the Golan Heights in southwestern Iran's ancient ruins. Satellite imagery is used to map at-risk monuments, while local preservation teams receive funding to implement protective measures against incidental damage. Potential de-escalation pathways. International mediators have floated several avenues to reduce tensions and avert wider war. Four-phase roadmap. Proposed by a coalition of European foreign ministers, this plan comprises a immediate cessation of airstrikes, B, exchange of prisoners and remains, C, phased sanctions relief coupled with Iran's temporary halt to ballistic launches, and D, commencement of renewed nuclear negotiations under IAEA supervision. Security guarantees for Israel would be overseen by a multinational enforcement mechanism with initial deployments from EU and Arab League troops as neutral monitors. Gulf Security Dialogue. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have convened an informal Gulf Security Dialogue in Riyadh, inviting Iran to join regional discussions on non-aggression pacts, no-fly zones, and maritime security cooperation. Participation hinges on Tehran's agreement to refrain from targeting commercial shipping lanes, an essential concession to maintain global trade flows. Track 2 engagements. Qatar, Oman, and Switzerland have facilitated Track 2 dialogues involving retired generals, former diplomats, and academic experts from both Iran and Israel. These back-channel talks explore confidence-building measures such as crisis line hotlines between military commanders, notification of planned exercises, and joint disaster response drills to foster mutual trust. UN Security Council framework. Under U.S. and Russian sponsorship, the Security Council is drafting a presidential statement that, while not legally binding, would reflect unanimous support for humanitarian pauses, respect for civilian protections, and a commitment to diplomatic negotiations. This text aims to establish a normative baseline without triggering vetoes. Domestic political pressures. Finally, both Tehran and Jerusalem face significant internal constraints. Iran hardline IRGC factions advocate continued strikes until Israel's overthrow, while moderate elements, including President Raisi's advisors, push for economic relief to alleviate worsening domestic hardships. Widespread protests over rising food and fuel prices could pressure Iran's leadership to de-escalate in exchange for sanctions waivers. Israel public opinion has soured with mass rallies in Tel Aviv demanding an end to hostilities and renewed focus on cost of living issues. Coalition fractures risk bringing down Netanyahu's government if no tangible progress emerges. Opposition leaders are poised to table a no-confidence motion should diplomatic overtures fail. In summary, the Iran-Israel confrontation has evolved into a multifaceted crisis spanning conventional missile exchanges, proxy front skirmishes, cyber intrusions, and space domain jamming, each compounding the complexity of de-escalation. From the IRGC's groundbreaking electronic warfare strikes that exploited vulnerabilities in Israel's air defense architecture to Hezbollah's open rocket war in Lebanon, to Houthi interdiction of Red Sea shipping lanes, the conflict now embeds itself across multiple theaters and domains. Both Tehran and Jerusalem possess significant strategic depth. Iran, with its burgeoning ballistic missile arsenal, hardened nuclear facilities, and proxy networks. Israel, with its air superiority, precision strike capabilities, and unparalleled intelligence assets. Yet neither side can claim decisive dominance, and the risk of spillover into neighboring states drawing in NATO under Article 5 or igniting broader Sunni-Shia fault lines remains grave. On the humanitarian front, the toll is stark: over 100 civilian fatalities in Israel, dozens of IDF technician and first responder deaths, and countless injuries from shattered glass fragmentation and shelter-induced trauma. In southern Iran, shortages of medical supplies, water outages, and displacement stress local hospitals already hampered by decades of sanctions. Lebanon's economic collapse intensifies the suffering of tens of thousands forced from border villages, while Iraqi communities near U.S. bases grapple with rocket barrages and military evacuations. Humanitarian agencies coordinated through Amman-based joint operations cells and cross-border medical corridors have averted even worse outcomes, but warn that any lapse in ceasefire will push emergency response capacity beyond collapse. Diplomatic efforts, though intensifying, face uphill battles. The United Nations Security Council's nascent consensus on humanitarian pauses and safe corridors demonstrates rare unity, but lacks enforcement teeth absent veto-proof mandates. Gulf states' overtures, Saudi-led security dialogues, Qatari shuttle missions, and Omani neutral ground negotiations reflect an emerging regional will to contain spillovers. European proposals for a phased roadmap leveraging partial JCPOA restoration and sanctions relief offer a plausible template yet require trust-building measures, long absent between Tehran and Western capitals. Meanwhile, U.S.-Russia-China trilateral discussions hint at great power rapprochement, but Beijing's strategic ambivalence and Moscow's transactional arms sales complicate these high-level engagements. Against this backdrop, leading defense analysts offer several clear recommendations for policymakers. Establish immediate hotline links. A dedicated military-to-military communications channel between the IRGC's strategic headquarters and Israel's general staff could prevent miscalculations. Comparable to Cold War-era back channels, a 24/7 crisis hotline would enable real-time alerts for planned strikes and safety-of-flight notifications, reducing the risk of unintended escalation. Implement a no-first-use confidence measure temporarily codifying a mutual restraint agreement wherein neither side initiates. Strikes beyond current ceasefire lines could stabilize front lines. Monitored by third-party observers from neutral countries, this measure would buy time for broader diplomatic negotiations. Launch a joint humanitarian initiative pooling resources from the EU, GCC, and UN agencies to fund cross-border medical evacuations. Water delivery convoys and trauma counseling centers would alleviate civilian suffering and build goodwill. High-profile joint statements by Israeli, Iranian, and Arab health ministers could signal a shared humanitarian imperative transcending conflict lines. Synchronize sanctions relief with de-escalation. Steps a calibrated sanctions easing package focused initially on medical and agricultural imports should be tied to verifiable halts in long-range missile launches. The U.S. Treasury and EU Council could coordinate a freeze-and-thaw mechanism releasing humanitarian funds in exchange for tangible Iranian modifications to IRGC operational patterns. Enhance regional security architecture, convening an expanded Gulf Security Forum inclusive of Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, and Oman, alongside GCC and Iran, would create a platform for long-term confidence building. Key components would include shared maritime patrols, collective drone defense protocols, and a rotating rapid response medical task force for cross-border emergencies. Promote Track 2 diplomacy continuity, institutionalizing back-channel dialogues among retired generals, security scholars, and civil society leaders from both countries can sustain dialogue even when official talks stall. Funding from neutral donors, Switzerland, Norway, and Japan could underwrite symposiums on conflict prevention, energy, cooperation, and jointly managed heritage preservation projects. Leverage international legal frameworks, encouraging both parties to accept third-party arbitration on disputed incidents such as friendly fire mishaps would build norms of accountability. The International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission, under Additional Protocol I of the Geneva Conventions, could be tasked with investigating major civilian impact events impartially. Ultimately, the path to lasting de-escalation hinges on political will on both sides to prioritize national stability and economic recovery over maximalist war objectives. Iran's leadership faces mounting internal unrest over economic hardships that only deepen under sanctions-driven inflation. Israel's government contends with eroding public support and coalition fragility that threaten its survival absent a credible diplomatic horizon. Both cannot sustain a protracted exchange that drains resources, alienates partners, and risks catastrophic regional conflagration. As we conclude this special report, it is clear that the coming days will test the resilience of every actor involved, from frontline civilians to global powers holding veto authority in New York. The potential to slide into uncontrolled warfare remains real. Yet the scaffolding for effective restraint also exists, drawing on lessons from past crises and an array of multilateral mechanisms. Whether these tools are wielded with the necessary urgency and humility will determine if the world witnesses a frozen stalemate or a full-scale Middle Eastern war. Thank you for watching this extended broadcast of Worldview Channel 247. I'm Jack. Stay tuned to our network for continual updates on this evolving story. Good night, and stay safe.